Okay, all the way to the end of the book of John this morning. We're in John chapter 21. I said this morning, I don't know, someone may be watching this at night and that doesn't work so well. John 21, we're at the end of our read of the Gospel of John, and this week is chapter 21, and so we want to talk about that a little bit. The question I want to pose, Jeff, is why is 21 here? And I say that for this reason. 20 strikes me as a perfect ending. You know,
Oh, yeah.
back into the resurrection, 30 and 31, believing you may have life in his name. That just is this great triumphal summary, right?
Yeah.
And so 21, we throw in a fishing story.
Yeah.
And so maybe what we need to just do in this podcast is talk a little bit about why is 21 here, and what's its role in the bigger purpose of John with this gospel?
Yeah, that's a great question. And in one sense, I mean, all we can do is offer what's hopefully faithful speculation. Chapter 21 is widely recognized as an epilogue to the book, as it were, because chapter 20 really kind of hits with a finality, and there's a sense in which the book does try to tie it up again. In that, literally where we were last week at the very end of chapter 20, where John adds his own kind of inspired commentary at the end. Now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of the disciples, which is not written in the book. And similarly, when you get to the end of chapter 21, John's back in verse 25 there with, now many other things Jesus did, were every one of them to be written, the world couldn't contain the books, so
he's kind of like preachers sometime. You think he's done.
Yeah.
And then a little more and he is done.
And he still wants you to have the sense when he's done that even more could have been said.
Yeah.
So it's interesting that both of those chapters, he kind of gets back to that same kind of idea. So why 21? Well, no way to be dogmatically certain. But a couple of things, kind of emerge as possibility. Number one, given that, in a sense, the official end, I don't know what the right way to put it is, the other end of the gospel, so to speak, ends with a question about Thomas and Thomas's reconciliation to, then you're left wondering about, what about Peter? And so John wants to show the rehabilitation of Peter.
So it's more people stories, like we've had throughout the gospel, but here at the end you got Thomas and his situation, and now what about Peter?
What about Peter? Because if the issue of the gospel is belief, and you saw Peter, and part of it does seem to be because and when we get to the actual details of the story about Peter, one of the things that John does, details matter, and you can always see this when you're reading this in English, but the word that John uses for the charcoal fire where the fish are is the same word as the charcoal fire in John's gospel back when Peter denies Jesus in the courtyard
in the court of the high priest.
So in other words, what John is dropping a hint at, because you don't have to put these details in unless you want, and again, the way John writes it in Greek is the same way that John wrote it in Greek earlier. So the connection, one of the connections that in Greek becomes clear, where we're really supposed to be making is two fires, two opportunities to confess Jesus. Peter fails at the first fire. He's in a different place at the second fire. Yeah. And so that may be one aspect of the story. So you had Thomas there at the end. What about Peter?
And in a sense, I guess you could kind of say that with the Thomas story, he gets kind of a second chance, right? He missed the first gathering.
Yeah.
He's not willing to believe, but Jesus gives him another opportunity to redeem himself.
Right. So there is, the way John tells the story, it's very clear that John wants this read over against his way of telling the previous story about Peter's denial of Jesus. The other part of it is because, some of why are certain things in there when there's so many other details. John's point, I could say so much more. When he talks about this whole, then Peter asking about, what about him? And it seems to be referring to John, and Jesus says, what does it, matter if I want him to remain until I come?
John is still alive.
That's the thing is, again, there's no way to be dogmatically certain about this, but there is outside the gospel evidence and possibility that this was the last of the Gospels composed. This might be what we could call literally, in a sense, a second-generation gospel. John is writing a gospel that's going to mostly be read by second-generation Christians. A number of the apostolic band are already dead. James died early in the book of Acts. If as some evidence points to, this gospel is not even written until after Peter's even dead. then but John lives to be an old man, and again, certain outside the Bible, admittedly, but reasonably plausible lines of evidence that have come down to us suggest John was the last surviving apostle and lived to be a very old man.
Yep. Some believe he's still alive.
Well, yeah, that's don't let's not go there today.
Well, there is.
Oh, I know.
And it's clearly a misread of what the text says.
Right. But John in some way has to address the fact that he's still here. And so rehabilitates Peter, sets the story, and it sets even Jesus saying at the end of the day, how long people live is really nobody's business but that person and God's, and you just need to do what you're supposed to be doing. So that story about Peter works on a couple of levels for what could be John's other purposes of adding this epilogue to what was otherwise a seemingly clean ending to the gospel. And then again, he wants to end where he'd previously ended, so to speak. By saying, and yes, I could have said even more. So you end chapter 20, I could have said more. In fact, chapter 21, let me say a little bit more and tie up some loose ends that maybe I can see people are going to wonder about or whatever. And again, let me be clear. We have no evidence that the gospel ever circulated without chapter 20. Not saying that, but just, this whole sometimes as you're wrapping up a book, so to speak, by inspiration, by whatever, by inspiration, you wind up, adding a bit more to tie up some loose ends.
So you want to mess with the Greek?
Well, we've already touched it a little.
Because I know how much you delight in the way people use the Greek in verses 15 through 17, right?
Oh,
and the different words that are there. It is an opportunity to learn, right? So what I'm saying to y'all is get ready for a rant. Because here it comes.
So the classic sermon, that's the other thing, part of what is Jesus doing, and the difference. Sometimes the classic sermon we've all heard, and let's be honest, we've probably preached in our younger days about the difference between phileo and agape there when Jesus is quizzing Peter.
Two Greek words for love.
Yeah, two Greek words for love. Phileo, and stereotypically the more friendly love versus agape, the self-sacrificial love. And so what Jesus is trying to do is get Peter to confess a deeper love than the phileo love and so forth. The problem with that interpretation is, when you read John all the way through in Greek, he's been using phileo and agape interchangeably. And so what it really is more stylistic variation. Just like when you write in English, you will switch synonyms for verbs. If you're writing in a paragraph, a similar concept for stylistic variation, you may vary the verbs or the nouns you're using and use synonyms. John's been using phileo and agape interchangeably all the way through, including at one point earlier in John's gospel, when Jesus says the Father loves the Son and the verb is phileo. I'm pretty sure the Father, I'm pretty sure the Father loves the Son more than the phileo spin that we put on it in John chapter 21. Right. You know what I'm saying?
Yes, exactly.
And so the problem, and it's actually a little bit of a lesson in the danger of trying to do word studies without knowing a language grammatically, being able to read it and understand it all the way through on its own terms in that language. So when you're just, using your Bible study software or using some concordance or something, whatever you have access to, and you don't actually know the language, understand how the language is working on its own merits and how John's style is to use these verbs interchangeably all the way through the gospel, you wind up making a point that's doesn't seem to be really there.
Yeah, just because you got a Vines dictionary,
or Logos software or whatever,
doesn't mean that you now hold the key to understanding the original languages. And one of the things I don't like about that is that I think oftentimes people are looking for hidden mysteries and meanings by digging into the etymology and the details of the original Greek words. I think the text is enough.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that there aren't definitional things that are interesting and useful sometimes, but by and large, for the average Bible student, we just need to look at the text and it will supply us with what we need to understand the words. And there is a danger of, I think, delving into an area where we really lack the expertise to use that rightly. And I think we need to be cautious about that.
To double down on that point, I think what we need to be careful of is sometimes we too, even though we want to be scripturally based, we too hunger for some new thing, to hear some new thing.
Yes.
And so rather than, using, the gospel that hasn't changed in 2,000 years to admonish and encourage one each other, depending on what we need in a circumstance, we desperately want to do something. And I'll tell you after, with literally about 30 years of original language experience myself now, where the languages really help is not in word studies. Occasionally, not going to paint with a completely broad brush. Occasionally, chesed in the Old Testament just doesn't translate well in English. There's a place for certain, but by and large, what the original language, where they really help with a better sense or different sense. I'm not sure what the right word is. I don't even want to hear right now, ironic, because we're talking about words. But with a richer sense of what's going on is only when you begin to be able to read it in terms of the grammar, the syntax, the things like that. When you begin to notice the patterns of how words are used across authors. So in other words, the word study doesn't actually bring nearly as much as people think it does, and they may well be misusing the language in their words because they don't have the facility to understand how the grammar is impacting the meaning of the word in the particular place they're trying to do something with it.
Which this text illustrates well, making a point that
that
probably John is not making.
If you'd been reading John all the way through, you'd realize he's been swapping these verbs out the whole way.
You've been reading them all through the way through in the Greek.
Well, yeah, exactly.
Okay, so wrapping up John this week. Chapter 21 is our reading. Hope to spend some time in John with your family. And then as we get right toward the end of the year, we're going to be reading Mark, and we'll give you a little primer on that in the podcast next week.